In the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, the largest armada ever sent into war moved through the darkness toward the coast of France. More than 5,000 ships, 10,000 airplanes, 200,000 men. The greatest military operation in the history of the world. And you already know how it ended. You've seen the movie. You know the soldiers made it off the beach. You know the war was won. But nobody ever tells you what actually made it possible. The beaches were almost the last thing that mattered. By the time the first American boot hit the wet sand at Normandy, the outcome had already been shaped. Not by any general, not by any weapon, not by any act of courage under fire, but by a lie. A single, audacious, perfectly constructed lie, told by a man no one had ever heard of. A man who had no military training, no intelligence background, no political connections. A man who, just a few years earlier, had been running a chicken farm outside Barcelona. Among the war's most daring figures is a man few had heard of at the time, Juan Pujol García, a Spanish poultry farmer turned British spy who duped the Nazi regime so effectively that they awarded him the Iron Cross while he was secretly working for the Allies. That's the story you've never been told. Not the story of bullets and blood, though there will be plenty of that. The real story of D-Day is a story about theater, about performance, about one man sitting in a small room in London, inventing an entire army out of thin air and convincing the most paranoid regime in history to believe every single word of it. At the time, German generals in charge of defending the beaches didn't believe the full-scale Allied invasion had even begun. Thanks to a series of deception efforts undertaken by the Allies, the bulk of Germany's defensive forces were 150 miles away when the Normandy landings were taking place. Think about what that means.
The most powerful military machine Europe had ever seen, the Wehrmacht, and it was looking in the wrong direction, on purpose, because one man made sure of it. His name was Garbo, and by the time this story is over, you'll understand exactly why the liberation of the Western world may have come down to a single radio message sent in the middle of the night by a failed chicken farmer from Spain. Before you go any further, if you've never heard this name before, you're not alone, and that's exactly why this channel exists. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? What time is it where you are right now? I want to know, because this story doesn't belong to any one country. It belongs to all of us, and it's only just getting started. Now, to understand what happened on June 6th, you first need to understand what the Allies were up against. Because D-Day wasn't just a military operation. It was a gamble with civilization itself, and the odds were not good. Picture a wall. Not a wall the way you're picturing it right now, not brick and mortar along someone's property line. Picture a wall that runs for nearly 2,000 miles, from the gray cliffs of Norway all the way down to the warm beaches of Spain. A wall of concrete and steel and wire and blood-soaked sand. A wall studded with cannon barrels as thick as tree trunks. A wall behind which crouched hundreds of thousands of soldiers who had been told one thing: let them come, and then kill them all. In preparation for what seemed like an inevitable showdown, Hitler had ordered his generals to fortify Europe's northern shore. He dubbed the resulting chain of fortresses, gun emplacements, tank traps, and obstacles the Atlantic Wall. And although it was one of the most impressive engineering feats of modern times, British, American, and Canadian troops would eventually breach it along an 80-mile stretch of French coastline in a single day. But in the spring of 1944, nobody knew that yet. All they knew was what they could see, and what they could see was terrifying. By mid-May of 1944, there were over 500,000 foreshore obstacles on the Channel beaches, 31,000 of them fitted with mines. Steel beams bent into jagged crosses, half submerged at high tide, built to tear the bottom out of any landing craft that tried to approach. Long wooden stakes driven into the sand at angles, each one tipped with a mine, designed to blow a boat apart before the men inside even knew they were dying. And behind all of it, in bunkers sunk deep into the cliffs and bluffs, German machine gun nests with arcs of fire so carefully calculated that there was almost no stretch of open beach that wasn't covered. Rommel himself believed that Germany would inevitably be defeated unless the invasion could be stopped right there on the beach. And he said it plainly: "It is absolutely necessary that we push the British and Americans back from the beaches. Afterwards, it will be too late. The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive." That was Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the man who had made the British run in North Africa, the man who had chased the Allies across Libya like a wolf chasing a wounded deer. He had been assigned to command Army Group B, the force responsible for defending the northern coast of France, and he had arrived on the job and been appalled by what he found. Shortly before D-Day, Rommel reported that construction on the Atlantic Wall was only 18% complete in some areas, as resources had been diverted elsewhere. Rommel was a realist. He knew the war in the East was grinding Germany into dust. He knew that fuel was running short, that concrete was running short, that trained men were running short. The acute shortage of manpower, materials, and mines, and the fact that transport could only be carried out by bicycle, horse, or cart made a comprehensive defense plan nearly impossible. Of the 10 million mines needed for just one division's 50-kilometer front, only 10,000 were delivered. 10,000 out of 10 million. That's how thin the wall really was. And still, even incomplete, even under-resourced, the Atlantic Wall was a death trap. The killing ground Rommel had designed around the beaches was real. The guns were real. The wire was real. German gun crews had spent months pre-sighting anticipated landing areas, constantly rehearsing the act of pouring artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire onto those designated killing zones. Somewhere in the English countryside, more than 1 million Allied soldiers knew all of this. They had seen the aerial photographs. They had studied the models of the beaches, built to scale, every bunker in its exact position. They had run training exercises on replica Atlantic Wall sections, getting used to the weight of wet sand in their boots, the smell of cordite and salt water, the sound of live fire overhead. By May of 1944, nearly 3 million Allied troops had been amassed in southern England. 3 million people, crammed into camps and barracks and requisitioned country houses all across the south of England. 3 million people who knew they were about to cross the Channel and try to storm one of the most fortified coastlines in military history. 3 million people who went to sleep every night wondering if they were going to come back.
Among those people was a young private from Ohio named Thomas Hicks, 20 years old, barely old enough to shave. He had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, worked his way through basic training, crossed the Atlantic in a troop ship so packed that he had to sleep in shifts. Now he was sitting in a tent somewhere in Wiltshire, sharpening his bayonet and trying not to think about what was coming. He didn't know exactly where they'd be landing. Nobody told them that. All he knew was what the sergeant had said. When the ramp goes down, you run forward. You don't stop. You don't look back. You run. 3 million people like Thomas Hicks. And over all of them, like a man carrying a weight that could crush a mountain, was one general, Dwight David Eisenhower. As the supreme Allied commander responsible for Operation Overlord, Eisenhower had overall responsibility for its success or failure. Success was far from guaranteed, and ahead of the invasion, he tried to communicate this honestly to those who would be taking part. Eisenhower was not a dramatic man. He was not a Patton, all fire and profanity and theatrical swagger. He was something harder to explain. A man who was genuinely calm under a kind of pressure that would crack most human beings into pieces. He had been appointed Supreme Commander after Stalin himself had demanded it. The
the decision to mount the invasion having been cemented at the Tehran Conference in November and December of 1943, where Stalin, on his first trip outside the Soviet Union in decades, pressed Roosevelt and Churchill for details, specifically demanding to know who would be in charge. Stalin had said it directly, "Then nothing will come of these operations. Who carries the moral and technical responsibility for this action?" It was a question that cut through all the diplomatic language like a knife through canvas. Someone had to take the weight. Someone had to be the name attached to the operation if it went wrong.
Roosevelt chose Eisenhower, and Eisenhower accepted, understanding exactly what that meant. Against a tense backdrop of uncertain weather forecasts, disagreements over strategy, and timing dilemmas connected to tidal conditions, Eisenhower ultimately decided before dawn on June 5th to proceed with Overlord. Later that same afternoon, he scribbled a note intended for release, accepting responsibility for the decision to launch the invasion and full blame should the effort to create a beachhead on the Normandy coast fail. He actually wrote the words, sitting at a table with the biggest naval armada in human history assembled outside his window, and the lives of hundreds of thousands of young men balanced on his signature, Eisenhower wrote out his own admission of failure, just in case. He tucked it into his pocket and went to talk to the paratroopers. But the most critical question, the one that was keeping every Allied planner awake at 3 in the morning, the one that no amount of firepower could fully answer, was still wide open. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. They had known for a year. The question was not if, the question was where. And that question was what gave one Spanish chicken farmer the power to change the outcome of the entire war. Here is something that most people never reckon with about the German military in 1943. It was not stupid. It was not blind. It was not run by the cartoon villains you've seen in the movies. The Wehrmacht's intelligence apparatus, the Abwehr, was staffed with shrewd, experienced professionals who had spent years building human networks across occupied Europe. They knew how to spot a liar. They knew how to run double agents. They had seen every trick in the book. And yet, a Spanish chicken farmer ran rings around all of them for 3 years. Juan Pujol García was born in Barcelona on the 14th of February 1914. Unlike many of his generation, he developed an intense dislike for all totalitarian ideologies. He loathed fascism, despised communism, and distrusted political extremism of any kind. In 1940, during the early stages of the war, he decided that he must make a contribution for the good of humanity by helping Britain, Germany's only adversary at the time. So he walked into the British embassy in Madrid and offered to spy for them. They turned him away. Between 1940 and 41, Pujol approached British intelligence multiple times, offering his services. At the time, however, MI6 and MI5 were drowning in volunteer offers, many of them crackpots or Nazi sympathizers, and Pujol was dismissed as just another enthusiastic amateur. Most people, turned down 3 times by the intelligence service of the country they were trying to help, would go home. Juan Pujol went somewhere else entirely. Rejected by British intelligence, Pujol took matters into his own hands. Still unaffiliated with any official agency, he approached the Germans, pretending to be a loyal Nazi supporter, and started feeding them completely fabricated intelligence, carefully crafted using newsreels, public broadcasts, and a Spanish-language tourist guide to Britain. Without training or backing, without ever having crossed the channel, he built an entire network of imaginary agents and began reporting to the Germans as though he were running an active spy ring in England. Let that land for a moment. He had never been to Britain. He was working from Lisbon. He was creating fake intelligence reports based on a travel manual, railway schedules, maps, and newsreels. The kind of research material you'd use to write a novel, not run a spy network. The Germans loved it. They were so impressed, they codenamed him Arabelle and paid him to continue. There's a detail from this period that should stop you cold. In his reports,
Pujol claimed that one of his British contacts had described soldiers stationed in Glasgow as men who would do anything for a litre of wine. A litre of wine. In Glasgow. The Germans, who apparently had never spent a Friday night in a Scottish pub, didn't even blink. They believed everything. They wrote back praising the quality of his intelligence. They sent him money. They asked him to recruit more agents. His false data was so good that he received a cable from the Abwehr reading, "Your activity and that of your information gave us a perfect idea of what is taking place over there. These reports have an incalculable value." An incalculable value. From a man who had never crossed the Channel. Eventually, the elaborate scale of what Pujol was pulling off caught the attention of MI5. The Allies finally accepted him when the Germans expended considerable resources attempting to hunt down a fictitious convoy he had invented. Following interviews by MI6's Iberian section, Pujol was taken on and given the codename Garbo, after Greta Garbo, chosen by his British handler Thomas Harris as the name befitting the best actor in the world. Harris was a remarkable man in his own right, a painter and art dealer by training, with a Spanish mother and a gift for improvisation that made him the ideal partner for Pujol's particular genius. The two of them, working together in a house in London, would spend evenings constructing characters and drafting reports, and then Pujol would go into another room and transmit them in character, in Garbo's slightly breathless, detail-obsessed voice, to Madrid. Harris pushed Pujol's instincts toward maximum impact. Pujol gave Harris's strategic vision a human texture that no amount of tradecraft training could have manufactured. Together, they were something neither could have been alone. From that quiet office, Pujol began systematically manipulating German war strategy. Together with Harris, he developed a network of over 20 fictional agents, each with their own backstory, communication quirks, and regional focus. Garbo submitted detailed, coded reports to Berlin via radio and courier. Reports carefully curated by MI5 to mislead and delay German reactions to real Allied operations. This wasn't just espionage. It was theater on a scale that had never been attempted in the history of warfare. The network he had constructed was the most elaborate fiction ever aimed at a government. At its heart were more than 20 fictional agents, each one a fully realized character with a name, a backstory, a personality, a job, a location, and a set of motivations that explained why they were betraying their country. Some were ideological, some were mercenary, some had personal grudges, some were simply greedy. Each one was built the way a novelist builds a cast of characters, except the reader was the Nazi high command, and the stakes were the liberation of Western Europe. One of the fictional agents was a Welsh nationalist, a man with ideological reasons to undermine the British war effort. He was supposed to operate in Wales and the Midlands. He didn't exist, but the Germans received dozens of reports attributed to him, complete with the kinds of regional detail, pub conversations, overheard remarks on trains, descriptions of factory output that gave him the texture of a living, breathing human being. Another was a communist courier who traveled between networks of like-minded individuals, which conveniently gave him access to information across a remarkably wide geographic area. Another was a Venezuelan student, whose social connections provided plausible access to British military circles. Another was a headquarters clerk. Another was a Greek sailor who spent time in different ports. The Germans never asked for photographs. They never demanded the kind of verification that would require any of these people to actually be real. They trusted Garbo's word. And Garbo's word was the word of a man who, by early 1944, had been sending them high-quality intelligence for 3 years without a single significant error traced back to him. Over 500 messages, 4 transmissions a day, 6 months of accelerating fiction, all pointing toward the same false conclusion. And here is where a certain group of intelligence historians quietly raises an uncomfortable question. The official story says the Germans were simply fooled. A minority view among scholars suggests that some inside the German command may have harbored private suspicions about Garbo's network, that the sheer consistency of his intelligence raised internal doubts that were suppressed, partly because the source was too valuable to question, and partly because careers had been built on trusting him. The Abwehr, by 1944, was an institution fighting for its own survival inside the Nazi hierarchy. Doubting their best source would have meant doubting themselves.
Whether Garbo was believed because he was brilliant, or believed because it was politically convenient to believe him, that question has never been fully answered. What is not in question is what the deception built and how completely it worked. Between January of 1944 and D-Day, those 4 transmissions a day flowed like a river of perfectly calibrated lies into the nerve center of the Third Reich, each message building on the last, each one adding a new brushstroke to a painting that was resolving, slowly, toward a single image. A massive American army, commanded by the most feared general in the war, poised to strike across the narrowest point of the English Channel. As part of what was called Operation Fortitude South, the Allies created the fictitious 1st United States Army Group, an imaginary force supposedly based in southeast Britain. Fake radio traffic and decoy equipment, including inflatable tanks and dummy landing craft, mimicked preparations for a large-scale invasion aimed at the Pas-de-Calais. There were fake army camps filled with empty tents, tanks made of inflatable rubber, and even a phony dock facility in Dover, assembled by a team of set builders from Shepperton Studios. At night, teams of men dragged car headlamps back and forth across fake airstrips to create the appearance of aircraft taxiing in the darkness. German reconnaissance pilots looked down and saw what they expected to see: a massive buildup of men and machines, exactly where common sense said the invasion would come from. And publicly declared to be in command of this fictitious army was General George S. Patton. The Germans considered Patton their most formidable foe, and were certain that his being publicly sidelined was merely a ploy, that he would be picked to lead the real invasion rather than be wasted as a decoy. It was perfect. It was almost too perfect, and that is exactly what worried the men running it. The Germans trusted Garbo more than they trusted their own aerial reconnaissance. By June 1st of 1944, the German High Command was convinced that the Allies had roughly twice the number of divisions actually assembled in Britain. 67 Allied divisions in the German intelligence estimate, when the real number was less than 40. Phantom divisions. Ghost soldiers, all of them aimed at a beach the Allies had no intention of storming. And somewhere in Berlin, in the warm, stifling offices of OKW, German officers were moving those ghost soldiers around on maps, planning their response to a phantom threat, drawing arrows on charts that pointed at a landing that would never come. The deception had become a parallel reality, a shadow war, fought entirely inside the German command's own mind. And the man who had built it was about to face the one pressure no deception can fully prepare for: actual contact with the truth. Because the truth was already out there. It was in the water. It was in the sky over Normandy, written in fire and smoke. And nothing that happened in any quiet room in London could change what it looked like to stand on a beach called Omaha on the morning of June 6th, 1944. But before the ramps went down, before the world changed in the space of a single morning, there was a night that the men who lived through it never forgot and never fully found the words for. On the evening of June 5th, Eisenhower drove to Greenham Common Airfield. He had already made the decision. He had already written the failure message and tucked it into his pocket. His meteorologist had given him a narrow window of marginally better weather, fragile as a soap bubble, brief as a held breath, and Eisenhower had looked at it and said 6 words: "I don't like it, but we have to go." Now there was nothing left to decide. So he went to talk to the men of the 101st Airborne Division, the paratroopers who would jump into the darkness behind enemy lines hours before the first landing craft hit the beach. His air commander, British General Trafford Leigh-Mallory, had twice made a formal, sincere argument that the paratroopers could not succeed in their mission and were being condemned to slaughter, predicting casualties approaching 80%. Eisenhower had overruled him, and now he was standing among the men he had overruled the prediction for, shaking their hands, asking where they were from, looking at their blackened faces and their camouflage helmets, some of them barely old enough to have finished high school. One of the paratroopers asked him if he was nervous. Eisenhower smiled and said, "Of course not," which was, by every account, a complete lie, delivered with the calm of a man who had decided that his own fear was not something these men needed to carry. He watched them board their planes. He watched the planes taxi and lift and disappear into the dark. His aide found him afterward, standing alone by the runway, saying nothing, staring at the sky where the planes had been. The aide later wrote that Eisenhower's eyes were full of tears, though the general never acknowledged it. Once the order was given, a strange powerlessness descended. Up to that moment, he could order changes in all aspects of the operation. Now, he had to depend upon other men, from the highest to the lowest positions under him, to do their jobs. Across the channel, in a house in Cannes, a French woman named Odette Duval heard the planes in the darkness and understood before any announcement what they meant. She had been waiting 4 years. Her husband had been taken by the Germans in 1942. She didn't know where he was.
She got out of bed and stood at her window and listened to the sound of engines filling the sky from horizon to horizon. And she said nothing, and she cried, and she didn't know yet whether to be afraid or grateful, so she was both. By midnight, the first paratroopers were already on French soil. The airborne operation was a chaos of scattered drops, missed objectives, and ferocious small unit fighting in the darkness, among the hedgerows and flooded fields of the Norman interior. Sticks of paratroopers from the 101st and 82nd Airborne were scattered across an area far wider than planned, some landing miles from their objectives, some landing in the middle of German positions, some drowning in the deliberately flooded lowlands near the Merderet River. A private named John Steele famously landed on the church steeple of Sainte-Mère-Église and hung there, playing dead, for nearly 2 hours while a battle raged below him. But the chaos served a purpose that nobody had designed into it. The sheer randomness of where the paratroopers landed threw the German defenders into a corresponding confusion. Reports flooded into German headquarters from across a huge area. Paratroopers here, paratroopers there, fighting in this village, attacking that crossroads. And the picture that emerged was incomprehensible. German commanders couldn't tell whether they were facing a concentrated force or a dispersed one. They couldn't identify the main axis of attack. They made cautious, piecemeal decisions when aggressive, concentrated ones might have destroyed the airborne forces before dawn. The confusion that cost the Allies cohesion also cost the Germans clarity. And in the balance between those two deficits, the airborne operation survived long enough to matter. At 6:31 in the morning, on a section of beach the planners had designated Omaha, the ramp of a Higgins boat went down. The plan, as designed by Allied planners, called for an initial bombardment, naval guns and air support, to destroy the German defenses before the first wave even got close to the beach. The bombers were supposed to obliterate the bunkers. The naval shells were supposed to tear apart the wire and the obstacles. By the time the ramps went down, the defenders were supposed to be stunned, disoriented, their positions wrecked. None of that happened at Omaha. The bombers, flying through heavy cloud cover, were afraid of hitting the landing craft below. They delayed their release by just a few seconds that, at their speed and altitude, pushed every bomb miles inland. Approximately 13,000 bombs were dropped by the attack force in the minutes before the landings. Virtually none of them hit the German defenses. Virtually none. 13,000 bombs. The fields behind Omaha were cratered. The beach was untouched. The naval guns had done better, but not enough. Not nearly enough. Because at Omaha, by a piece of catastrophic luck, The defenders happened to be one of the strongest German formations on the entire Normandy front. The 352nd Infantry Division, battle-hardened, well-led, fully manned, had moved into the Omaha sector just weeks before the invasion for exercises. Allied intelligence had not registered the change. The planners had expected a second-rate garrison force. They got veterans who had been sleeping in those bunkers long enough to know every angle of fire, every dead ground fold in the terrain, every approach that the beach's geography forced an attacker to take. When the ramp went down, the water in front of it was chest deep and cold as a knife. Men who stepped off the ramp into water over their heads, weighted down with 60 pounds of equipment, never came back up. The ones who could swim, or who found their footing, came up into a wall of fire that had been waiting for them. The duplex drive tanks, the specialized armored vehicles designed to swim through the surf and provide cover for the infantry as it crossed the open beach, had been launched too far from shore. The English Channel on the 6th of June was not a test-range pond. The waves were running at 4 to 6 feet. The flotation screens were canvas contraptions never designed for conditions like these. 32 tanks were launched. 27 of them sank. The crews drowned inside. 3 tanks made it to the beach. 3 out of 32. The infantry came in to find a beach that had not been bombed, without armor, against defenders who had watched the entire bombardment fall harmlessly into empty fields and who were now fully alert, fully armed, and fully positioned behind concrete that had not been touched. And the tide was coming in. This detail changes everything about how you understand what happened. The beach at Omaha at low tide is several hundred yards wide. By the time the first wave landed, the tide was rising. Every minute that passed, the strip of sand available to the men trying to cross it shrank. Every minute of delay pushed surviving men closer together in a narrowing kill zone that the German machine guns had been pre-sighted to sweep with mathematical precision. Staying still was death. Moving forward into the guns was nearly death. But nearly is what matters when you have no other options. Private First Class Harold Baumgarten of the 1st Battalion of the 116th Infantry Regiment stepped off a landing craft into a beach that had become a machine for killing. He watched the man in front of him get hit before he reached the water. He watched men around him go down in the surf. He was hit himself, once, then again, and kept moving. He said afterward that he crossed the beach because stopping felt indistinguishable from giving up, and giving up felt indistinguishable from dying, so he moved. The first wave assault companies were shattered within the first 30 minutes. Company A of the 116th, a National Guard unit from the small Virginia town of Bedford, suffered losses so concentrated that the community felt it like a physical blow. Bedford, population just over 3,000, had sent a large proportion of its young men into Company A. The losses that morning turned it into one of the most bereaved communities in America, a grief so specific and so deep that it shaped the town for generations afterward. A family in Bedford got the news days later, delivered by telegram on a Tuesday afternoon, on a street where the elm trees were just coming into full summer leaf. The telegram was a single paragraph. It did not explain what the beach looked like. It did not explain how the morning had gone. It just said that their son was not coming home. And then life was supposed to continue. Across Omaha Beach, the story repeated itself in hundreds of variations. The medic who moved from man to man, knowing he couldn't save most of them, but kept moving, because stopping felt like abandonment. The sergeant who stood up in open fire and told the men around him that there were only 2 kinds of people left on this beach, the dead and those who were about to move. The lieutenant, who had never expected to lead anything larger than a platoon, who suddenly found himself organizing the remnants of 3 different companies because everyone above him was gone. By mid-morning, the battle at Omaha had stopped following any plan that had been written in England. Small groups of soldiers had begun working their way up the bluffs, not because orders told them to, but because the bluffs were the only place that wasn't the beach, and the beach was where you died. They found gaps in the wire. They moved through draws in the cliff face, one at a time,
covering each other, pulling each other up. The German strongpoints, designed to fire outward toward the water, were suddenly vulnerable from above and behind, from positions their architects had never anticipated, because the architects had assumed the beach would stop everyone.
It didn't stop everyone. It stopped most, but not all. By late afternoon, Omaha Beach was not secure. It was not clear. It would not be fully cleared for days, but it was crossable. The exits were opening. The impossible geometry of the morning, the open ground, the rising tide, the guns that covered every inch of sand, had been bent, partially, through individual acts of will that no planning document had accounted for, and no military doctrine had prepared anyone to execute. Approximately 2,000 Americans became casualties at Omaha Beach on June 6th. Dead, wounded, missing. Some estimates run higher. The records are incomplete because the chaos was total, and because some of the men who went into the water that morning were never recovered. 2,000 people in one day on 5.5 miles of sand. To stand on that beach today, in July, in the sunshine, with the sound of gentle surf and families walking the tide line, and to try to map the morning of June 6th onto what you're seeing is almost impossible. The beach looks too ordinary, too peaceful. The distance from the waterline to the base of the bluffs is maybe 300 yards in some sections. A walk you could do in a few minutes on a quiet afternoon. On June 6th, it took some men hours, and some men didn't make it, and some men got halfway, and that was as far as they ever got. The white crosses on the hillside above the beach number 9,388. Each one is a count, not a metaphor. The geometry of the cemetery, the rows curving gently with the hillside, the silence that settles over the place in a way that feels almost physical, is not designed to inspire. It's designed to make you understand a number you cannot otherwise understand. And it still doesn't fully work. The number is too large. The human mind wasn't built to hold it. Sword Beach, easternmost of the five, went better than anyone had reason to hope. The British 3rd Division moved off the sand with enough speed and enough violence that the German defenders couldn't concentrate their fire. By mid-morning, British troops were moving through Norman villages, past stone walls and church steeples, and old men standing in doorways who had been waiting 4 years for this moment and didn't know whether to weep or run. Gold Beach went roughly as planned, which meant men still died, positions still had to be stormed at close range, and the gap between design and reality was still measured in bodies. But the gap was survivable. The units moved, the objectives fell. Juno Beach, assigned to the Canadians, was something else. The landing craft came in late, missing the brief window when the tide would have cleared the German beach obstacles. A third of the landing craft were lost or damaged before they even reached the shore. The Canadians who made it to the beach found the defenders alert and firing. They attacked anyway. There's something in the word "anyway" that resists easy explanation. It isn't heroism exactly. It isn't recklessness. It's what happens when human beings are placed in a situation where stopping is indistinguishable from dying. And so they move, not because they aren't afraid, but because fear, at a certain intensity, stops being a reason not to move and becomes the engine of movement itself. Utah Beach was almost a miracle by comparison. A strong current had pushed the landing craft south of their intended touchdown point, and by pure accident, they came ashore where the German defenses were lighter and the exits from the sand were more accessible. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the son of the former president, 56 years old, walking with a cane because of his arthritis, the only general who had personally requested to land with the first wave, stood on that sand and made a decision so simple it barely sounds like a decision. He looked at where they were, he looked at where they were supposed to be, and he said, "We'll start the war from right here." His men laughed, the kind of laugh that happens when the absurdity of a situation collides with the presence of someone who refuses to be defeated by it. And then they moved inland. Utah was the cheapest of the 5 beaches in human cost, just under 200 casualties. Against what happened 40 miles to the east, It might as well have been a different war. By nightfall on June 6th, the Allies held a strip of French soil a few miles deep in most places. Not a victory, not even close to a victory. A foothold, purchased at enormous cost, fragile, dependent for its survival in the critical days ahead on something that had nothing to do with what happened on those beaches at all. The message Pujol typed in London that night was not a warning. It was the most important performance of a 3-year career built entirely on performance. He confirmed to his German handlers in Madrid that Allied forces had landed at Normandy. He gave them that freely because the Germans already knew. It was in every newspaper. It was on every radio. The news was already crossing Europe. What Pujol gave them wasn't the fact. It was the interpretation of the fact. And the interpretation was this: Normandy was a diversion, a calculated sacrifice designed to draw German reserves away from the real target. His agents, his 27 fictional, meticulously constructed, completely non-existent agents, had confirmed it independently. Multiple sources, different regions, all pointing to the same conclusion. The 1st United States Army Group under General Patton was still assembled in the southeast of England, still pointing at Pas-de-Calais, still waiting. The real blow was still coming. Normandy was a trap, and if German command moved their armored reserves to respond to it, they would be walking straight into it. Hold that image. The beaches were, at that precise moment, soaked with American blood. Boys from Ohio and Georgia and California were lying dead in the surf, and the man responsible for making sure those deaths purchased something lasting was sitting in a quiet room in London, his fingers on a telegraph key, lying to the people who were killing them. War has no mercy for its instruments. It just uses them until they break or until they win. The genius of the message was not in what it said, it was in who was saying it. By June of 1944, Garbo had spent 3 years becoming the most trusted intelligence source in the German system. His reliability rating inside the Abwehr was extraordinary. He had been awarded the Iron Cross Second Class, normally reserved for frontline fighting men, requiring Hitler's personal authorization, presented via radio by a regime that believed it was decorating its most valuable asset in Britain. On the Allied side, he had received an MBE from King George VI, presented in November of 1944. The same man, the same acts. 2 medals from 2 enemy governments, each one absolutely convinced they knew whose side he was on. When Garbo told the Germans that Normandy was a diversion, he was not asking them to believe something implausible. He was confirming what they already believed, through a source they already trusted. With the apparent backing of an agent network they had no reason to doubt. He was giving their existing conviction the final piece of evidence it needed to become certainty. That is the most elegant form of manipulation that exists. Not planting a new idea, but watering the idea already growing until it blocks out everything else. And it worked. In Berlin, in the warm offices of OKW, the Garbo message arrived and was read and was immediately circulated to the senior planning staff. The intelligence it contained aligned perfectly with every existing assessment. It corroborated the aerial reconnaissance, which had photographed the fake army in southeastern England. It matched the signals intelligence, which had been monitoring the fake radio traffic of the 1st United States Army Group. It confirmed what Hitler himself had been saying for months. The real blow would come at Calais, because Calais was where a rational enemy would attack. At this same moment, Erwin Rommel was on the phone, hammering at the High Command to release the Panzer reserves immediately. He had been driving back from Germany when the invasion began. He had gone home for his wife's birthday, believing the weather too bad for any landing, and he had covered the miles in a controlled fury, arriving at his headquarters to find a situation already hours old and deteriorating. He understood, with the instincts of a man who had fought this kind of battle before, that the window for throwing the Allies back into the sea was measured in hours, not days. He wanted the armor. He needed the armor. He demanded the armor. He didn't get it. The The two panzer divisions closest to the beachhead, the 12th SS and the Panzer Lehr, were held in reserve by the High Command, awaiting Hitler's personal authorization. And Hitler, briefed on the invasion after his late morning rise, looked at the information in front of him, the Garbo message, the intelligence assessments, the aerial reconnaissance of the fake army at Calais, and held the line. This was the diversion. The reserves stayed in place. Those hours that the panzer divisions spent waiting were the hours when the beachhead became real, when the supply chain from ship to shore began to function, when the units pinned down on the beach in the morning began to move inland in the afternoon, when the margin between catastrophe and survival, which had been razor-thin all day, began slowly to widen. On June 9th, 3 days after the landings, Pujol sent one of the most audacious transmissions in the history of intelligence. Acting through one of his fictional agents, he confirmed that the Normandy landings were precisely what he had predicted, a diversionary attack. He stated with absolute confidence that the 1st United States Army Group remained assembled in southeastern England. He expressed controlled irritation that his earlier warning had not been acted on in time, the tone of a professional who was disappointed, but still in command of his sources, still trustworthy, still the best asset in the system. The Germans believed him. The Germans acted on it. The day Pujol's message arrived in Berlin, the German High Command issued a directive confirming that the 15th Army, the force guarding Pas de Calais, the force that could have moved through to Normandy and changed the entire strategic picture, was to remain in position. Not a division transferred, not a regiment shifted. Hold, wait. The real blow is still coming. At Bletchley Park, where the Allied codebreakers were reading the German command traffic in near real time through the Ultra Intelligence program, the analysts watched this directive arrive and understood what they were looking at. The women and men in that room, hunched over machines in a building that smelled of damp wool and cigarette smoke, and the particular tension of people who knew things they could never say out loud, processed the signal with the same focused efficiency they brought to every intercept. But some of them had brothers on those beaches. Some of them had husbands. They had spent the night of June 5th listening to the drone of the transport planes going over, and knowing where those planes were headed, and knowing they couldn't tell anyone. They couldn't say anything. They couldn't go home and comfort anyone. They could only watch the numbers come in and understand what the numbers meant and keep working. What they could see in the accumulating signal traffic of June 6th and the days that followed was that the deception was holding. The German command was paralyzed by its own certainty. It had been sold a story so complete, so internally consistent, so elaborately corroborated across so many independent-seeming sources, that even the reality of 5 Allied divisions storming 5 different beaches could not dislodge it. Reality was knocking at the door, and the man inside was so sure he knew who was there that he refused to open it. The 15th Army held its position at Pas de Calais until late July, 7 weeks after D-Day. 7 weeks during which the Allies consolidated the beachhead, built up the supply chain, and pushed inland through the hedgerow country of the Bocage. 7 weeks during which those hundreds of thousands of men, soldiers who could have, in the first critical days, tipped the balance on the beaches, stood guard over empty water, and waited for a blow that was never going to come. The physical courage on those beaches, real, overwhelming, the kind of courage that fills the word to its absolute limit, had purchased the foothold. But the foothold survived because of something that looked nothing like courage. It survived because a man with a radio transmitter and a genius for fiction had spent 3 years building a reality inside the enemy's mind, and that reality had not collapsed, even under the weight of an actual invasion. There is a version of the story of D-Day that is entirely about the beaches, and that version is true. It's completely true. What happened on those beaches was exactly as extraordinary as history says it was. The sacrifice was real, and remains real in the most permanent sense, in the names carved into marble, in the white crosses on the hillside at Colleville-sur-Mer, in the particular silence that settles over that cemetery and does not lift. The version of the story that stops at the beaches is not wrong, it is incomplete. Because what the beaches purchased, at that price, in that currency, would have been lost in the days that followed if the German armor had moved when it should have moved, if the fiction had collapsed at the critical moment, if one thread in the web that Pujol had been spinning for 3 years had been pulled at the wrong time. What Pujol did was not separate from what the soldiers on the beach did. It was the same act, committed through different means, at the same level of stakes, with the same consequences for failure. The difference is that one story has monuments, and the other spent decades locked inside a classified archive. For years after the war, the full truth of what Garbo had done remained sealed. Pujol himself lived quietly in South America under a false identity. He had faked his own death, partly out of fear of reprisal, partly to protect the intelligence methods that had made his operation possible. He disappeared so completely that historians who knew something of the operation's outline didn't know whether he was alive or dead. He was alive. He was living in Venezuela, running a bookshop in Caracas. The man who had constructed an imaginary army, manipulated the strategic decisions of the Third Reich, and helped secure the conditions for the liberation of Western Europe, was selling books on a quiet street in a city where nobody knew his name. And the Germans who had awarded him the Iron Cross, who had praised his intelligence as having incalculable value, who had staked their entire defensive strategy on the reliability of a source they never once physically verified, they never fully understood what had happened to them. Not during the war, not in the immediate aftermath, but the question was already forming. In the quiet moments when a German analyst in Berlin looked at the accumulating evidence from Normandy, the scale of the assault, the depth of the supply chain, the speed with which the Allies were consolidating what should have been a fragile beachhead, and felt something cold and specific move through him. Not panic, not anger, just a thought, arriving without announcement, that something in the picture he had been given did not add up. The thought was simple. The thought was, what if we were wrong about all of it? What if Normandy was never the feint? What if there was never going to be a second blow at Calais? What if the army they had been watching in southeastern England was made of rubber and radio waves, and the words of a man who had been lying to them since 1941? What if the most trusted intelligence source in the entire German system had been, from the very first message, looking them in the face and inventing everything? The moment that question moved from private doubt to official reconsideration, everything would change. Because when the Germans understood how they had been fooled, when they could trace the deception back through the phantom agents, back through the fake radio traffic, back to the man at the center of it all, they would begin looking for him. And Garbo, who had survived 3 years by being invisible, would become the most wanted man in Europe.